Do you have one or a couple specific games that exist almost as real places in your mind? Games so full of memory and time spent there that you can close your eyes and see its world around you? Well, my friend, you've probably suffered from addiction. Video game addiction. And what better games to sink thousands of hours into than, no, not MOBAs, MMOs. Today we're getting sweaty. Academically, that is. We got a whole ass investigation to look into. If you're one of my few followers, thank you, I love you and appreciate you, you are the best. Then you probably watch me for my FPS games videos. Why the fuck am I making a way too long video on MMOs? Well, I'll tell you why. I fucking love MMORPGs. When I was a little kid, I was introduced to addictive substances, namely Lego Universe, rest in peace. A simple Lego MMO that began a lifelong spiral into WoW subscriptions. I've played a whole bunch of others too. Guild Wars, Final Fantasy, no, not that one, the other one, there we go. RuneScape, Lord of the Rings Online, Lost Ark, but really it's mainly just Warcraft. I promise, I do still have a life. But MMOs are just so much fun. They really are the video game version of D&D. There's so much to do, so much to see within a massive world, so many fun people to meet. So why don't I make videos about MMOs if I love them so much? And I gotta break it to you, MMO videos are fucking boring. Woo, I got a tiny little character that you can barely see through my 36 buttons and macros covering my screen. What do you mean nothing's happening? Look at my damage numbers. This is a fucking epic battle going on, the peak of human efficiency and cooperation. Aren't we badass? Listen, some people can make it epic and engaging. However, I am not one of those people. Even if MMOs don't make for the best television, though, you gotta admit, they're so much fun. But enough dilly-dallying. Like I said, we have an investigation to focus on. I have a case file right here. Let's see. The mission statement is in here somewhere. Aha, it's right here. It says, find out why the fuck modern MMOs are the way they are, comma. Are MMOs dead, comma, also WoW. So it's not a lot to go off of, but hey, I say let's do some deep diving.
Online role-playing computer game called EverQuest.
They're not your arcade-type games with stunning graphics. Their visual display consists of the basic characters. This is an example of what's called a multi-user game. Several people can be online playing
time computer game against an opponent anywhere in the country.
These are all the files it takes and his characters to play the game.
Imagination is a big part of the appeal of these games. Players can take on identities of their alter egos. Getting hooked on a game like this can be expensive, but there are plenty of people willing to make that investment for
If you're anything like me, then it's not enough to simply enjoy a thing that you like. You want to know how it works, where it came from, and why it is the way that it is. As a kid, I loved finishing a movie and then turning on the behind the scenes to see how it was made. I would try and find art books for my favorite shows and games to see their artistic process throughout development. It's exciting to learn about how things are created, and in my opinion, that background knowledge can really enrich the experience of entertainment. For example, understanding how tumultuous Pixar's early years were really puts into perspective the success of their first films. Sometimes learning the history of a project can give a lot of insight into how the industry around it works. Certain pieces of entertainment are so influential that they affect the way things are done going forward. Knowing how insanely rushed and crunched the Halo 2 development was gives you a real appreciation for the fact that the game is somehow not fucking hot garbage. But for real, it makes you feel really bad for those Bungie developers. If you don't know about this one, the crunch time was mind-bogglingly stupid and arguably set a horrible precedent for the games industry going forward. But today I want to take a peek into something a little less soul-crushing than that. The games that defined and changed the MMO genre. Because a lot of them are indispensably intertwined with the history of multiplayer games in general, and beyond that, PC gaming as a whole. I'm sure we all know what MMORPGs are, at least we probably have a cursory idea of what they involve. It's a genre that has long appealed to players worldwide. The idea of sharing a persistent world with others, surrounded by strangers going about and progressing on their own adventures, questing and growing stronger in ability and power, taking part in fictional economies, and gambling, baby! It's enchanting. If you're at all connected to the MMO sphere, you've probably heard a lot of complaints in the past decade about modern MMO design, about how progression is impacted by corporate monetization. Yeah, I guess that one is kind of everywhere these days. Or what about the lack of meaningful player interactivity? Or the stripping of many RPG elements from games? Some people even decry modern MMORPGs as, quote, no longer true to the genre, unquote. There's an impression that design is moving away from what used to make these games so great. But how did we get here? What did make these games so great before? What paved the road for MMO games of today, and when did everything start to change? Well, to answer these questions, we gotta go back. Way back. Starting at this point in time, I'm gonna run through some groundbreaking and notable games throughout the years. This isn't an exhaustive list, because that would take way too long, but these games paved the road for what would follow. If you want to know more about any specific game I mention here, I want to absolutely recommend Josh Strive Hayes' YouTube channel. He makes a lot of great content of deep dives on old or niche MMOs, and you should absolutely check him out.
What gives you the right to talk to me? Who the hell do you think you are?
Like so many other forms of media, MMOs can trace their roots all the way back to tabletop role-playing games, specifically Dungeons & Dragons. In the 70s, D&D was taking off, and game designers were taking notes. Not just other TTRPG creators, but early computer game developers as well. In the year following D&D's release, dozens of attempts were made to copy the formula into computer games. These games weren't generally sold to the public, they were programs written for mainframe computers at universities. And as a result, very few have survived to this day. Information on what games have remained is pretty sparse and sometimes conflicting. Many of these programs were upgraded and built on in the following decade as well, further increasing the difficulty of understanding what these games were originally like. One of the earliest popular computer RPGs that we know of was simply called The Dungeon. Creative, I know. There are legends that there was an even earlier RPG, perhaps the first computer RPG, called M199H. Geez, these names. But that's just a myth. The Dungeon was created by a guy named Rusty Rutherford at the University of Illinois in the year following Dungeons & Dragons' tabletop release. Like so many other early computer games, this one was obtuse and simplistic, although it actually featured graphics display, a rarity during that time, and it was also the first ever game to feature what we now refer to as boss encounters. Other games existed alongside this one, all named similarly: Crypt, Drygulch, and Moria. Colossal Cave Adventure was another such game that borrowed elements from Gygax's creation. It was a 1976 program that found relative widespread success at the time. The game was text-based, and the program acted as the game master, explaining and describing events and locations around the player. Cave Adventure is often pointed to as the game that kicked off the adventure game genre and is credited to being the direct inspiration for numerous other historical games, such as Rogue and Adventure for the Atari. One of these games that Cave Adventure inspired was called Zork. The developers of Zork, located at MIT in 1977, set out to craft a game that was the, quote, better text adventure game with more complex inputs and puzzles that were less obtuse. The development of this game is actually a pretty fun story. The devs of Zork didn't announce their creation at first, but there were students who would search through the mainframe to find new programs, and they discovered the game, leading to dozens and then reportedly hundreds of people who began testing and playing the game alongside its development. Code was changed to allow the program to run on a couple different systems, and physical mailing lists were created to distribute updates to the game. Eventually, it was ported and published in 1980 to the TRS-80 personal computer, releasing under the name Zork, the Great Underground Empire. A man named Roy Trubshaw, a student at the University of Essex in the UK, considerably enjoyed a variant of Zork and began to work on his own dungeon project in 1978. He dubbed the program Multi-User Dungeon, or MUD, and this is kind of where it all began. MUD, or MUD1 as it came to be called later, ran on the local University of Essex network and became widespread there when accounts were created to allow students to connect on weekends between certain late hours. In 1980, the university connected its internal network to ARPANET, which was basically one of the first public internet networks. In doing so, MUD became the very first internet multiplayer game of all time. Some say it single-handedly kickstarted the entire online gaming industry. I say that's maybe a little bit of a stretch. It was certainly super influential though. The game was finally shut down in 1987, but it left a massive number of derivatives in its wake. And many of these MUDs continued to run until the mainframes they were based off of were decommissioned for good. In the late 1980s, when personal computers with modems began to grow more affordable to the average consumer, the MUD-like genre was absolutely exploding. The games became so popular that MUD was joked to have stood for Multi-Undergraduate Destroyer due to the amount of time dedicated to them by students. I guess some things never really change. In 1989, the game Avalon: The Legend Lives was released and can actually still be played online today. It was one of the first online persistent game worlds without traditional resets, and introduced cooldowns, PvP, professions, and concepts like player-run governments and player housing. Things are starting to feel a little bit more familiar, huh? To modern players, it might be hard to understand how these primarily text-based online games allowed for meaningful interactivity between players. MUD players would probably tell you that in some ways it allows for interaction that is less constrained compared to the modern MMO. The vast majority of concepts that we consider to be quintessential to MMORPGs were birthed here. And though you couldn't watch your character stand next to your guildmates, they were there, fighting with you or in some cases against you, sharing items, chatting, grouping together to delve into dungeons. It really was still the online version of D&D. Imagination and cooperation was required, and these worlds seemed like truly endless adventures where anything could happen. If these kinds of games sound interesting to you, then you should know that there are still a lot of MUDs online and kicking today. You can find them online in various places. I know one of the ones I tried out recently was called Aardwolf, and it seemed pretty cool. As technology progressed, though, text-based games were getting less of the spotlight as graphical games were becoming more and more popular on personal computers. Many MUDs began to incorporate rudimentary displays of their worlds, either with ASCII art or actual sprite gameplay. The title of very first graphical online RPG is usually given to the famous Neverwinter Nights. This game released in 1991, and like modern MMORPGs, it required a subscription to play. Not monthly, mind you, but hourly at about $6 per hour, which in today's money equals to be almost $14 an hour. If I paid that much for my WoW subscription, I would have nothing to my name with the thousands of hours I've put into Azeroth. Originally, Neverwinter Nights boasted a server size capacity of about 50 people, but in 1995, each server had been increased to 500 simultaneous players. At its peak, you could expect around 2,000 players online during primetime hours, and for this reason, Neverwinter Nights is sometimes attributed to being the very first MMORPG. Things wouldn't look too similar to our modern MMOs, though, until the mid-90s, when the world received its very first 3D graphical MMO, Meridian 59. Again with the names. A pretty standard sword and sorcery adventure, this game boasted a fully explorable 3D setting with other players that you could see walking around the world with you. It was also a PvP-focused MMO, and it could be pretty unforgiving for new players trying to get established in the game. Although this one is a historical first, it's often overshadowed by the much more popular Ultima Online. Just a few months after Meridian 59 released in 1997, Ultima released to widespread public acclaim. though it was also difficult and sometimes punishing as well due to the PvP nature of the game. And in spite of early low predictions of success, Ultima Online reached over 100,000 subscribers within its first 6 months. This was the first ever MMO to reach these peaks, and it was declared the fastest growing online game ever at the time, with an eventual peak of over 225,000 paying users. Player housing, the player-driven markets, the ability to focus exclusively on professions. These were just some of the things that cemented this game into the hearts of players all over the world, and it still boasts an active user base to this day. Ultima Online is often credited with popularizing the MMORPG genre, although things were just getting started. Many of the popular MMORPGs around this time were created by Western developers, but in 1998, Korean developer NCSoft tossed their ring into the game with the release of Lineage, another isometric MMO similar to Ultima. The game was released both in America and in Korea, although the majority of its subscribers were in the East. Numbers for this game's subscription base are a little tricky to pin down with specific dates, but at one point, the game reported over 3 million subscribers. At this point, 1999 was rolling around the corner. Pokemon was booming, Tiger Woods was popping off, and society was having a meltdown about the coming end of the world. And Microsoft was stepping into the world of MMOs as well with the release of Asheron's Call. Though plagued with meta and balance issues, the game was extremely innovative for its time. Instead of large-scale expansion releases, the developers opted for monthly releases of content, focusing on in-game events and crafting the game's story with the actions of the players in mind. A famous example of this was when a crystal called the Shard of the Herald was added to the world, spawning a powerful demon when broken. Players on one server grouped together to guard the shard and prevent it from ever releasing its demonic presence, but the developers eventually recruited a player to betray the guilds and unleash the monster. Events like this rarely happen in more scripted, modern games, and it's little wonder why players of this era look back on Asheron fondly. But Microsoft wasn't the only titan stepping into the MMORPG genre around this time. The famous EverQuest, published by Sony Online, was released earlier that year, in March of 1999, and quickly took the world by storm. Within 24 hours, the game had over 10,000 subscribers, and by 6 months, the game had over 150,000, overtaking Ultima's title of fastest growing online game of all time. EverQuest was heralded as the most immersive and addictive online RPG to date, quote unquote, with critics praising the game for raising the bar for MMORPGs in every conceivable way. Each expansion was ambitious, adding new races and classes alongside new areas to explore. Eventually peaking at a subscriber count of 550,000 players, EverQuest absolutely dominated the online RPG space up until the early to mid-2000s. The gaming industry was starting to truly pay attention to the genre now, with the following years exploding with new MMO releases, desperately trying to tap into the goldmine that had been discovered. Companies were branching out, and dozens of new games were being developed in an attempt to find a niche. MMORPGs were still releasing in droves, but so were MMO games that focused less on the RPG elements as well. 2001 saw the release of The Dark Age of Camelot, which quickly became a competitor with Ultima and EverQuest, eventually reaching a peak subscriber count of 250,000 players. RuneScape and Phantasy Star Online were released in 2001 as well, with the next year seeing the birth of Ragnarok Online, MapleStory, and Final Fantasy XI, which is often viewed as the first proper MMO to be released on consoles. 2003 saw the releases of Shadowmane, EVE Online, Toontown, Star Wars Galaxies, Second Life, and Lineage 2, which garnered massive success in Korea once again. While the MMO sphere had not yet broken into the wider gaming industry, it was certainly becoming more and more saturated, and no one could quite reach the success that Sony had found with EverQuest. No one, that is, until late 2004. There was already quite a lot of interest surrounding World of Warcraft since its development was announced back in 2001. Blizzard was a titan of the PC gaming industry with massive hits such as StarCraft and Warcraft 3, and many players couldn't wait to see what they had in store for their MMORPG. Sony Online expected to compete, but ultimately dominate WoW with their upcoming EverQuest 2 launch, scheduled to release during the same month. We all know how that ends. When World of Warcraft finally did release to the public, it took the entire gaming industry by storm. The game was plagued with server issues in its first few months, although this was mainly due to the onslaught of players overwhelming Blizzard's infrastructure. By the first quarter of the following year, the game had amassed over 1.5 million subscribers, a success that was previously unseen not just for the genre, but for the gaming industry in its entirety. Player counts continued to rise, and by the end of 2005, 5.5 million players were subscribed to the game. Blizzard had made the decision to simplify some of the popular MMORPG elements and reduce the punishing difficulty that was standard at the time for the genre. Decisions that quickly proved to be commercially successful. One prominent example of this is in EverQuest at the time. If you died, not only would you lose all of your items, you would also lose a fair amount of XP on your character. World of Warcraft made it where if you died, you didn't lose all that. You didn't lose your items, your XP. You simply had to go find your corpse and start over again. World of Warcraft was one of the first true MMORPG games that appealed both to longtime fans of the genre as well as to newcomers. The world was expansive and detailed, the gameplay intuitive, the questing magical, and the community closely knit. By the end of the game's first expansion, WoW boasted over 11 million subscribers, eventually climbing up to a peak of 12 million during the second expansion. The MMORPG genre was forever changed with the release of World of Warcraft, with no other game coming anywhere close to its success. EverQuest's population crashed and burned in the years following, and many other game launches during this time met limited or minimal success. WoW was simply the king of the genre, and it looked like it would stay that way for the foreseeable future. Some MMOs would persevere under the shadow of Blizzard's behemoth of a game, such as RuneScape and Guild Wars, but many developers began to look to Blizzard's incredible success and attempted to imitate it with their own releases. During the mid to late 2000s, this led to a stifling of the genre overall, as studios made less of an attempt to innovate like before, and instead focused on duplicating Warcraft's mechanics for their own games. These games came to be known as WoW clones, and rarely captured the same magic. Warhammer Online, Runes of Magic, All Odds Online, Order and Chaos Online, and Algernon Online. Do you even recognize any of these titles? These are just some of the games that failed to innovate and found little success, or in many cases, were ultimately shut down. Even in games that did try to change the MMORPG formula, still in a lot of ways followed in WoW's footsteps. Smaller, instanced raids and dungeons, less world PvP, questing hubs, and easier leveling are just some of the things that seem to become the norm. Developers also began to measure their success not on their own scales, but in comparison to Blizzard's. There were still some MMOs that managed to find a niche and a steady user base, but nevertheless were eventually shuttered as their publishing studios were unhappy with the success and numbers that failed to rival WoW's millions. New MMORPG releases were morphing into attempts to be the next WoW, or the WoW killer as it came to be called. In the early 2000s, the genre was saturated, sure, but there were many concurrently successful games that were different and varied enough to capture their own corner of the market. After the boom and failure of numerous WoW clones, though, many developers began to look to other genres for their projects. Some still attempted to break into the MMORPG space here and there, often with infamously poor results, such as 2014's WildStar, which ended up shutting down permanently just 3 years later. There were some games that did find a niche, though. Lord of the Rings Online found some success in 2007, bolstered by the popular Tolkien IP. Similarly, Star Wars: The Old Republic launched in 2011 and briefly reached a peak subscriber count of 1.7 million. Guild Wars 2 in 2012 was one of the first proper MMORPGs to forego a subscription requirement on release, managing to capture a sizable user base of its own. Final Fantasy XIV had a failure of a launch in 2010, but was relaunched in 2013, finally finding some success. Black Desert Online and The Elder Scrolls Online both released in 2014, both to mediocre reception, but eventually managing to grow sizable audiences. 2017 saw Lost Ark's massive success in Korea, eventually releasing worldwide in 2022. Amazon also made the decision to launch their own MMORPG, New World, in 2021. All of these games, while having varied successes at launch, have managed to grow and maintain healthy populations. Final Fantasy XIV in particular has enjoyed the spotlight in the past few years, especially during World of Warcraft's infamous Shadowlands expansion, which bled players left and right to other MMOs. Recently, we found ourselves in something of a second golden era for MMORPGs. Today, there are numerous options for fans of the genre to enjoy. However, at the same time, it's common to hear players bemoaning many of the features that modern MMOs bring to the table. Things that World of Warcraft began to popularize in the past 15 years can still be found everywhere. While MMORPGs are infamously still massive time sinks, the difficulty and struggle that was present in older games is harder to find nowadays, with many players, myself included, lamenting this fact. Many MMOs have found themselves shifting to a free-to-play model instead of requiring a monthly subscription in an effort to find a wider reach as well, leading to numerous, if not all, modern MMOs offering microtransactions and in-game purchases that many consider to diminish the experiences of these kinds of games. I think it would be remiss to neglect to mention how modern internet culture has affected the genre as well. Early MMORPGs found success partially because it was just an easy way to connect and socialize with other people. With the advent of social media and just more widespread connectivity in general everywhere, the social aspects of MMOs have diminished. Online games of all kinds saturate the market, and the average modern person finds themselves inundated with constant and instant connections inside and out of the gaming sphere. It's no wonder the genre feels so different nowadays. It was one that was built on the foundation of socialization and cooperation, yet the majority of modern MMOs can be played almost completely alone. A shift from social worlds to simply games. The fact that millions flocked to Blizzard's re-release of vanilla World of Warcraft should be a telling sign that players do still long for that kind of connectivity, even if that connectivity is yet still dumbed down from earlier MMORPGs. So, what does the future hold for the genre? The landscape of the gaming industry and the world as a whole is just so different from only 15 to 20 years ago. The audiences that MMORPGs find themselves presented to is a completely different one. Younger generations seem to have less patience as a whole for grinds or necessary cooperation. Modern, larger releases are focusing more on casual gameplay, with less old-school RPG elements entwined with their worlds. MMOs are sometimes ordered into 3 eras. The beginning generation of games with the birth of the internet, the second generation with the turn of the millennium and growing technological capabilities, and the third era, which is often simply marked by World of Warcraft's release and sway on the industry. It's my belief that we're entering a 4th era of MMORPGs, although I think it still remains to be seen exactly how that era will be defined. Design is finally beginning to shift away from so many of the tenets that we expect from the genre. Games like Fortnite, Grand Theft Auto Online, or Destiny 2 push the boundaries of what we consider to be MMOs. More and more games as a whole are featuring online interconnectivity on differing levels, and modern traditional MMOs seem to be growing more and more rare with their releases. There have been some games in development, however, that appear to focus on more traditional aspects of the genre. Ashes of Creation is an upcoming launch that is said to focus on dynamic player-led changes to the world, one where interconnectivity and cooperation is key. Riot Games has also announced their development of an MMORPG, although details are still a bit scarce at the moment. Many hold out hope that the genre will begin to shift back towards what made those old games so special, but that remains to be seen. Looking back to the beginnings of the genre, it's absolutely incredible what's been accomplished. Whether the MMORPG genre ever reaches its previous heights again or not, it's undeniable that the impact it's had on the online gaming industry is, well, massive. For better or for worse, the MMO genre has been an influence beyond gaming, with impacts on technology, monetization, community building, and storytelling. Titles like Neverwinter Nights and Ultima Online were pioneers in server infrastructure for games. Many more games have created and fostered communities that have transcended the sphere of gaming. I'm sure nearly every MMO player has memories and friends from the time they spent in those worlds. Some of the best memories I have with gaming period are from MMOs. Warcraft, LEGO Universe, and Final Fantasy XIV, just to name a few. These will always hold dear places in my heart as living, breathing worlds with wonderful and interesting people to meet. These games, once upon a time at the very least, were so many people's homes online. Places where lifelong friendships were made. Just like Dungeons and Dragons, I think these games will continue to have an enchanting appeal for the foreseeable future. No matter what happens in the future, though, I believe that MMORPGs will endure, in one way or another. If you made it to the end of this video, then just a heartfelt thanks from me to you. I really appreciate this support, especially considering my previous video, which was kind of an offshoot of this one, which I've been spending a good time writing. These kinds of videos are a lot of fun for me to make. I love doing deep dives on entertainment and genres that I really enjoy. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more of my stuff in the future, and I hope the beginning of this year is a great one for you. Take care of yourself, and thanks for watching.